So sugar is half glucose, half fructose. High fructose corn syrup and honey are about 55% fructose, 45% glucose. That figure varies a little bit. Fruits are different amounts of glucose and fructose, but they are just glucose and fructose. So someone says, oh, fruit's natural sugar. No, it's still glucose, it's still fructose. They are the same biochemical pathways. So fructose, we didn't know a lot about that until about 2010, with pretty well definitive papers being written. So, and we're still learning about it, but nonetheless, fructose doesn't get not much absorption in the mouth, but it comes up the gut into the liver, and it's pretty well fully metabolized in the liver. Small amount in the gut, in the mesentery, the wall of the gut. Very small amount in the testes, but so that's, I think, related to our fertility. Again, we don't need to eat that, but that's the only other spot where it's metabolized. So the body does everything in its capacity to stop the fructose getting into the bloodstream. It all happens in the liver. A small amount turned into glycogen, but bugger all because most is glucose. Fruit, we know you make wine from fruit, and it's the fructose component. And the liver does the same thing. There's a thing called an aldehyde pathway. Put fructose into the liver, fructose gets metabolized to aldehyde, which is an alcohol, and we end up with this. If you have too much fructose, then you end up with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. You end up with the same pathways that we see in alcoholic liver disease, cirrhosis. But we're now seeing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease as a normal finding on CAT scans of the abdomen, on MRIs of the abdomen. 8% of 10-year-olds have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that's a paper from probably 7 or 8 years ago. So it can only be worse now. So we're seeing children with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And there have been a few papers now which say that if you take fructose out of the diet in teenagers, that liver change is restored to normal within weeks. So, it's a reversible situation. The liver has a great capacity to heal itself. So fructose has an aldehyde pathway. It has a uric acid pathway as a breakdown, and uric acid inhibits nitric oxide production. Nitric oxide is that one I talked about in the blood vessel walls, but nitric oxide is not only there to keep our blood vessels open and keep them working, it also has an effect on maintaining our circulation in the brain, and also a function in our immune system for allowing the white cells to move into tissues which are damaged. So white cells have got to get to the point of repair, and they do that under the effect of nitric oxide. If you have too much fructose in your diet, you produce too much uric acid and you lose mobility of those white cells. It's called motility. And again, there have been some studies going back 30, 40 years looking at white cell motility under glucose loads and sugar loads. There's a great study done. It was a pilot study that effectively looked at if you eat carbohydrate, you in fact slow up your white cell function for around 72 hours. And if you fast, you improve white cell function. Now, as a surgeon, forever, we give, you go to after the hospital, you give people food after their anaesthetic. They've had an operation, they give them food. And most hospitals serve up bread, ice cream, biscuits, orange juice, that sort of thing. From a healing aspect, from a white cell function aspect, that glucose, carbohydrate, sugar load, which we give people within a couple of hours, is halving our healing ability for the next 72 hours. And what's the most critical time after an operation that you want everything to be working? It's the first few days, isn't it? Well, you want it to be working all the time. But what we're doing is we're giving people something which is slowing up their healing the moment they wake up after an anaesthetic. And that data's been around for decades. Yet, we choose to ignore it because that's It's much easier to give people, white bread and a bit of cake and a biscuit and a fruit juice. It's driven me insane, that, over a long period of time. Another thing that fructose does is it makes us hungry. When you eat fructose, it will make you hungry. And it does that by a couple of pathways. One is it stimulates ghrelin. And ghrelin is a hormone you feel in your stomach, which gives you the rumbly tummy. It's a hunger hormone. And fructose inhibits leptin. Now, leptin is a hormone produced by the fat in our bodies. And if you've got plenty of fat on board, it tells you you don't need to eat anymore. The fructose inhibits the leptin's effect back on the brain, the hypothalamus. And as a result of that, we have a double-edged sword. We've got something telling us, even though our body's telling us we've got plenty of fat on board, you don't need to eat anymore. The fructose is saying ignore that, and it will give you the ghrelin. Now, the proof of that in nature is that animals, when fruit comes into season, which is the only natural source of fructose, apart from honey and breast milk, but when fruit comes into season at the end of summer, beginning of winter, animals are driven crazy to eat as much as they possibly can so they get fat for winter storage, for winter hibernation. And it's the fructose component of it that does that. It's the fructose component that's telling the animal to eat this, gorge themselves so they get fat for winter. We also see that, I don't know if you've seen some of the videos of monkeys eating fruit on a tree when it comes into season, and the monkeys actually lie around drunk afterwards, totally lethargic, because of the alcohol effect. So what are the implications for us as humans in modern society? Well, if you eat fructose, you are going to be hungry all of the time. There's also going to be an alcohol pathway which is going to be making us lethargic, tired, less motivated. Have we noticed this in society? Yes, we've got fatter, sicker, lazier. We're coming up to Christmas now. Christmas is, the family get together, you have the big lunch, and half the family are asleep by in the mid-afternoon. And a little bit of it's the alcohol they've drunk, most of it's the food. Everyone's just lying around tired and lethargic. So again, the biochemistry is fructose. The observation is it's having that effect. Fructose continues to have effects. It actually increases insulin resistance in muscle, so it makes it harder for the glucose to be managed by the muscle as a fat storage. The other thing that fructose does is it ultimately, as a waste product, gets converted into small, dense, low-density lipoproteins. Now, the term lipoprotein is what's been loosely called good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. Lipoproteins are combinations of lipid, which is fat, and proteins to actually move them around the bloodstream. So fat in itself will just float in water. So fat by itself is not easily transportable in the bloodstream. Proteins are not easily absorbed into the bloodstream, so they combine in a combination called a lipoprotein to be transported around the bloodstream, so that you can take your protein from the liver and the fat, where that's the metabolism's done, and it's then transported into the tissues. And those lipoproteins end up being of all different shapes and sizes and densities. And so that's why we end up calling things good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. So a terrible term. There's a whole spectrum of lipoproteins. And the only way to really work out what's good and bad is to do a thing called a lipid subfraction analysis. Forget your standard cholesterol test, the standard profile that's done. The only thing that's decent in that is a triglyceride level, because the triglycerides are an indirect measurement of the small dense LDLs. So most people, I only know the numbers here for Australia, you're told your triglycerides are good if they're less than 2. But if they're less than 0.7, which is where mine's 0.6, not bragging, it's just what it is, 0.7 means you have no small dense LDL particles floating around the bloodstream. So it's the poor man's test of that on a standard lipid profile. If it's higher than that, then you do have them. So what happens with the small dense LDLs? They're the ones which actually float around the bloodstream, and I call them they're a Goldilocks particle because they can get into the blood. They're just the right size and shape to get into our blood vessel walls. So they don't just go through the blood, they go through the blood vessel walls and they get stuck there. Now, in an old society going back 100 years, you can eat your sugar, you can eat your carbohydrates, and you will produce small dense LDLs. The problem's been that remember I call that lipoproteins. The proteins haven't changed much over time, but the lipid, the fats have. So 100 years ago, the omega-6 component of the fat was about 1%. The omega-6 component of the fat in our bodies is now about 25 to 30%. So people have heard of omega-3s and omega-6s and omega-9s. As it turns out, we do need very small amounts of those, but the amount, once you get past that limit, then they become inflammatory. And they become inflammatory because they can become oxidized. And if 30% of the fat in our fat is now omega-6, it becomes oxidized and that becomes highly inflammatory. So we've got these small dense LDL particles being produced by fructose. They then get into our organs, into the blood vessel walls. They are oxidized there. It becomes a whole inflammatory mess. Do you want me to go back to saturated fat versus polyunsaturated?
Let's go there, but first I want to make a connection with something you brought up earlier. The glucose in our system, when it hits a certain threshold, having that leaky, damaging impact on the glycocalyx. So I'm trying to tie this into the part of the story you're at now with the small dense LDL from fructose. I would have to imagine that glucose-fructose combination together with the damage to the glycocalyx would enhance the issues of the small dense LDL.
Yes. I use the term, it's a perfect storm. You know, we've compounded one upon the other. We've upped the glucose, we've upped the damage, we upped the fructose, we upped the particles which are causing more damage, and then we add in the seed oils, which are inflammatory. Bang, we've got the perfect storm. We've got a description of modern disease. We've also got the fact that 40% of glucose is converted to fructose by a thing called the polyol pathway. And that to me was the runaway train moment. You know, we can put everything together, but if we actually then create so much glucose load on the system and finding out that 40% of it's turned into fructose, which is even more small dense LDLs, which is more particles which are ready to get oxidized. Bang, it's not everything. I think there are other chemicals in our food system. I think there are other toxins in our food system. I think we've got other issues in our bodies, not enough sleep, not enough light, or the wrong light. I find all that light thing, all of those are other contributing factors. But at the core of it, what fuel you put in your car determines how the car's going to run. You can put as much paint and polish and clean it and vacuum it and all that sort of thing has an effect on your car. But it's the fuel that's the primary issue. And so I think that's where the modern diet, the conventional modern diet, is, I think, toxic, inflammatory, progressive, but also able to be remediated. So you can just do the opposite of that and reduce the sugar, the carbs, and the seed oils and see what happens. And so many people following you, me, others have done that and gone low carb or gone keto or gone carnivore, because that is the opposite of eating an ultra-processed conventional diet. And then you see what happens to yourself by literally just reducing this inflammatory load. Like it's so damn obvious. If someone's hitting you with a bat, in the face, just walk away from it. If you're driving up the highway and there's all this traffic coming at you, turn around, do the opposite. And the biochemistry is simple. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. If an orthopedic surgeon can understand this biochemistry, what about all the other clever doctors out there? We're just the carpenters of life. But but one of the things about orthopedics is about, here's a problem. How do we fix it? And that's all I've done is we've just gone back to what is the root cause. Well, the root cause is we're putting the wrong fuel in the car. Let's put the right fuel in the body and then see what benefits. And it changed my clinical practice so much. Just by people changing their diet meant I ended up operating a lot less. But people took control of their lives, they were empowered, and they improved their health, and they didn't need an operation. Or maybe they needed a knee replacement, but we put it off for 6 months. We put it off for a year. We put it off for 2. And I can guarantee you it's much easier to recover from a knee replacement when you've lost 5 or 10 kilograms than if you're carrying an extra 5 or 10 kilograms.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Now, my take on carbohydrates, particularly glucose and fructose, if they're so good for us, why does the body do absolutely everything in its capacity to get it out of the bloodstream?